Welcome to episode 146 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about John Coltrane's debut album from 1957, Coltrane, which is not to be confused with the 1962 album he also issued with that name. And it's recorded basically about 2 weeks after he'd gone cold turkey in Philadelphia and cleaned up his act. He's also just on the cusp of this 6-month period he spends with Thelonious Monk in the latter part of 1957. And Monk would engage him in all kinds of musical ideas and possibilities and genuinely mentor him in a way that Miles never had. Here, as a leader for the first time, we don't really get the daring and challenging music we get a few years later. Coltrane doesn't yet have the technical ability he developed rapidly in the next few years, but there are some real high points and some glimmers of what he was going to become. John Coltrane was born in 1926 and he grew up in High Point, North Carolina. His dad died when he was 13, and his mom and some of the other members of his family ended up moving north to find work. He ends up staying with other members of the family in High Point. He finishes high school, during which time he takes up the alto sax, and then upon graduation he too heads north, and the family eventually is reunited in Philadelphia. He reached adulthood during the Second World War, and in 1945 he was drafted into the Navy. The war, of course, is coming rapidly to a conclusion, and he never actually sees active service. After the war, he returns to Philadelphia. He plays with a variety of big bands of varying quality, and eventually he gets invited to join Dizzy Gillespie's big band, and he stays with Dizzy until 1951. At some point in this period, during the late 40s and early 1950s, he becomes addicted to heroin, and this makes him kind of difficult to employ. Despite these challenges, his talent and the quality of his playing just kept breaking through, and in 1955, he gets another really big break, and he gets hired by Miles Davis to form part of what would become Miles Davis's first great quintet. Miles, his new boss, had of course himself been formerly addicted, and so as a consequence, he had both empathy for Coltrane's situation as an addict, but also frustration and impatience when the cracks began to show. With this hiring, Coltrane is now squarely in the big time, but that doesn't mean that the critical consensus was aligned around his work. And in fact, not only at this point, but later in the 50s, into the 60s, and really all the way to his death, there were always critical notices which were unconvinced as to what he was doing. Some people got what he was trying to do, others were skeptical. Miles's first great quintet, of course, included Miles on trumpet, Coltrane on tenor, which he'd taken up because he felt there was so much that Charlie Parker had achieved on alto, there was nowhere really to go, so he wanted to try something different. Philly Joe Jones on drums, Red Garland on piano, and Paul Chambers on bass. When Coltrane arrived, Miles had a bit of an administrative problem going on because he had a deal with Columbia, but he'd also made a commitment to Prestige to produce a whole bunch of records, and he had to get these out in a hurry. As a consequence, in this first period that Coltrane spends with Davis, they're frequently in the recording studio. The new Miles Davis Quintet is recorded and comes out in November 1955, and 1956 sees a whole bunch of different recording, including the famous marathon recording sessions, which produced Cookin', Relaxin', Workin', and eventually in 1961 Steamin'. Through this period, Coltrane was extensively busy in the studio as a sideman for other leaders, and unsurprisingly, as his own fame grew in the 1960s, a lot of those records were reissued under his name as the leader, whereas in fact he'd been the sideman originally. However, despite all this recording and success and effective validation, Coltrane is still struggling with heroin all the way through 1956, and Miles ends up firing him in October and then relenting and bringing him back on board, at least for a little bit of time, in November of that year. Entering 1957, although he's increasingly a name in the jazz world, he's never actually recorded as a leader, and in the early part of that year, he gets 2 different offers from 2 different labels. The first of those is with Blue Note, and he goes to their offices and he meets with Alfred Lyon, who is the owner of Blue Note, who offers him basically a handshake deal to make a record. The office cat disappears, Alfred Lyon has to rush out to the street and go get it, doesn't come back for a while, Coltrane ends up leaving, and the record never gets made. Subsequently, Bob Weinstock at Prestige Records reaches out and says, "John, I'll give you a record deal for 3 albums a year. I'll pay you $300 a record." And so Coltrane agrees to take this deal, and this album is the first product of that arrangement. But before any of that can happen, thanks to his heroin habit still not being under control, his relationship with Miles Davis is unraveling, and in April 1957, Miles fires him out of his quintet. Coltrane is shaken by the dissonance of major labels wanting to work with him and at the same time not being able to hold down a position in a band, so he goes home to Philadelphia, locks himself in a room for a couple of weeks, cries like a baby by all accounts, and goes cold turkey, has the beginnings of a spiritual awakening, which one day would take him all the way to a love supreme, comes back to New York, and goes almost immediately into the studio to make this record. The recording sessions for Coltrane's debut took place on May 31st, 1957, at Rudy Van Gelder's home studio, not his purpose-built one he would have later, but his home studio in Hackensack, and Bob Weinstock was in the producer's chair. There are 6 different sidemen used in this record. Paul Chambers is on bass. On side 1, the piano is played by Red Garland, and both Chambers and Garland are known to Coltrane because he's been playing with them, of course, with Miles Davis. The piano on side 2 is handled by Mal Waldron, who's probably best known for his work with Jackie McLean, and at this stage Waldron was essentially the in-house jazz pianist for Prestige. There's room for baritone sax in this record, and that's played by Sahib Shahab. Shahab and Coltrane had crossed paths not for that long, but at least for a period of time in Dizzy Gillespie's big band in the early 1950s. And rounding out the group are two friends and occasional bandmates of Coltrane's from Philadelphia, Tootie Heath on drums and Johnny Splon on trumpet. And of these two, Splon is the mystery man. This is his only known recording. It's not possible to find any open source photograph of the guy at all. And according to Coltrane's biographer, not much is known about him, except for the fact he was a friend of Coltrane's. He used crutches, which made it difficult for him to perform, and that may account for why he's not particularly well known. There are 6 tracks in this record, 4 covers, of which 2 are ballads, and 2 originals, Straight Street and Chronic Blues, and I kind of think the titles of those may have something to do with his recent struggles kicking the habit. The album did all right for itself despite an indifferent review in Downbeat, but things would only go up from here. Coltrane is just about to join Monk for an incredible 6-month period of musical ferment. His next album, Blue Train, would be released in early 1958 and will go gold. And he's also rehired by Davis in what would be their final uneasy joust as bandmates, making some incredible music before Coltrane truly heads off in his own direction around 1960. The album starts off with a song called Bakai, which had been written by Cal Massey. The title of the song, Bakai, means cry in Arabic, and Massey had written the song as a tribute to Emmett Till, who of course had been murdered by a white racist mob not long before. This has a standard head arrangement like almost all the songs here, and then it breaks into a nice swinging bop number. You've got Garland playing a lovely kind of airy solo over a walking bass line by Paul Chambers. And then you have Coltrane's first solo as leader, and it is, you have to say, unmistakably Coltrane, despite the somewhat conventional surroundings. It's very clearly his tone. It's also very clearly Coltrane trying to shovel as many notes, as many ideas, as many thoughts into each line as he possibly can, and still the notes are all falling off the side of his wheelbarrow. As I say, though, this is still relatively conventional playing. It lacks the fire or the technique of his playing in the 1960s. Then Shahib comes in to finish off the song on baritone, and this really is quite conventional. It almost sounds a bit pre-war, I think, this solo. The next song, Violets for Your Furs, is a standard. This is a ballad, and it starts off with a nice little introductory piece by Garland. This song was originally recorded by Frank Sinatra, and apparently it's inspired by Lana Turner, and this is just a good excuse to put up a picture of Lana Turner. It's fair to say that although Coltrane as a player in terms of his whole career was not somebody that you associate with ballads and standards, he always took his ballads seriously, and that is very much the case here. His treatment of the melody is reverential and delicate, and I think this is one of the most beautiful pieces of playing on the whole record. The last song on side 1 is Time Was, which is not so much a standard, it's a bit obscure. This has a nice melodic solo from Coltrane, I think a pretty decent solo from Garland, and then a strangely muddily recorded solo from Chambers, which kind of dulls the effect of that. And this is kind of an unusual thing to comment on a record which is engineered by Rudy Van Gelder. This track I think is just okay. I think if this were a rock review, I'd just call it a decent album track. Side 2 starts with Straight Street, which is the first of the 2 originals on here, and I think the better of the 2. Again, the solo is very recognizable as Coltrane in terms of his exploration of the upper parts of the horn's range, those diagonal runs he does, the multiple attempts at different kinds of passages. Not techniques as fully elaborated here as they would be elsewhere, but again, there are glimmers of where he's going to go. Splon and Waldron also have solos here on trumpet and piano respectively. Shahib's also on this track, but really only to fill out the head arrangements. He doesn't do any soloing on baritone. The second of the 2 ballads is the next song, and that's While My Lady Sleeps, and I think this is a tremendous track. It's full of kind of eeriness and anticipation. It's almost a bit like a film noir. It starts off with a walking head arrangement, and Coltrane is very much in a kind of narrative frame of mind, and there's some real kind of Middle Eastern tones to his playing. The key part of this track, however, is the tension which is achieved by the rhythm section of Heath and Chambers, in particular that one hanging bass note which keeps repeating, just keeps the energy and the anticipation of the song going all the way through. The album concludes with Chronic Blues, which is the second of the 2 Coltrane originals, and as with the first, you get the impression he's just got so much to say he can barely get it all out. There's notes just flowing over the side. There's a nice piece of playing by Splon and a pretty smoky solo at the end by Waldron. It's a solid, if unspectacular, effort. This is an historically significant album with some of the very best sidemen of the post-bebop days on board. It gives a fairly healthy indication of where Coltrane's voice and sound were going to go. He hadn't really found that true sound yet, and despite the cranky critics who were uncertain at this stage about where he was going, how much this was really jazz and so on, this is actually pretty commercial, pretty standard fare compared to where he would go in the future. The originals are intriguing without being brilliant. The best songs on here are the ballads, but this is enjoyable pretty much all the way through, and I give it a 4 out of 5.